everybody. My name is George. I'm the general manager and programmer at Amherst Cinema, and we are thrilled to have joining with us today Andrew Bujalski for our first ever digital retrospective of a filmmaker. Andrew, do you mind introducing yourself to the viewers at home?
Hello, viewers at home. I'm Andrew Bujalski. I'm an independent filmmaker. I've made 6 feature films, which we will we'll delve into shortly. And that's all there is to me. I just made the films, and that's all I have to show for myself.
Well, that's more than enough, as people will come to see.
Okay.
So can you tell me very briefly about Funny Haha?
Funny Haha is a movie from 2002 that we made. Very, very quickly, very small movie about a young woman, a couple years out of college, trying to figure out what the hell to do with herself and why.
And then your next film was Mutual Appreciation. Can you tell us about Mutual Appreciation?
Mutual Appreciation is a movie from 2005. Another little 16 millimeter black and white movie. It's another young person's movie. It's about a guy, a musician who moves from Boston to New York in pursuit of the reason all musicians move to New York, and finds himself in some kind of romantic messes.
And Beeswax?
Beeswax is a movie from 2009 about a pair of twin sisters, one of whom is a co-owner of a small vintage clothing shop, and her business relationship is falling apart, and so she's relying on her sister, relying on an ex-boyfriend to try to get her through these crises.
Computer Chess?
Computer Chess is a real weird movie from 2013. It's a kind of, I don't know, semi-psychedelic period piece about early computer chess programmers in a convention of them all losing their minds.
That's such a good movie. Results?
Results is from 2015. It's I think it's a romantic comedy about personal trainers, which, sounds so much more commercial than it is.
And Support the Girls.
Support the Girls is a movie from 2018, I think. It's about a woman who is the general manager of a highway side restaurant, if you will, all the kind of knockoffs and descendants of Hooters, and it takes place over a very harried day or two of her career there, trying to clean up a lot of messes.
So I think the easiest place to start is the beginning of your feature films, which is Funny Haha. And one of the things I've been, as I've been revisiting some of your work, a few of them for the first time over the past week, one of the things that's been kind of striking to me is this through line with some of the characters, which I always draw back from with Funny Haha, which you're an actor in, you wrote, directed, edited, and there's not much of a larger cast of people involved with that. So can you talk about when you first started on a film, if you had a sense of, universe building or a sense of an arc of some of these characters taking place over time, or things you were writing, if they couldn't make it in there, if they would end up in a different film?
Yeah, well, I think anybody, and especially if you aim to continue doing it for a while, I think you always have a kind of reserve of ideas or things that you're coming back to, either intentionally or not. I mean, all the time I can't tell you how many times I've written something that felt incredibly fresh and exciting and new to me, and then you have a week's perspective on it, and you go, oh, okay, I've done this before, I've done that before. It's all you revisit a lot of the same things over and over. But I think you're always carrying around, and sometimes it's just images, feelings, things that you don't necessarily have a place for, but eventually maybe they find a place. In a way, one of the great advantages, and I think sometimes my wife gives me a hard time. She says that I'm a declinist because I usually I tend to prefer everybody's early work, because there's something very, very exciting um, about the first things people do. You know, there's always this great burst of energy, and there there may be less craft and what have you, but I always find that work very exciting to watch. And I will say, with whatever perspective I have on, we're talking about a movie that's an 18-year-old movie now, old enough to vote, not old enough to drink, um, but it's probably drinking anyway. It the you mentioned world building, and that's something that, like, you can go to Hollywood and you can work on a TV series and you can spend millions of dollars and have the greatest minds in the business all working on world building. The world building we were doing there was our world. I mean, that's a movie about young people, and so we're plugging directly into a culture, and that to me is one of the most exciting things that film can do. And it's kind of the thing that I think I'm always chasing, one way or another, is to try to put something that feels alive on screen, but also feels like it belongs to its own culture, not something that's just been fabricated by a group of professionals. I think that's where I kind of tune out with a lot of things. And it gets trickier. The further along you go and the more money that gets spent, the harder it is to make something that doesn't feel like it was just the hard work of a bunch of professionals, which is fine. But I like to feel like there's something natural and something organic at the heart of it. And certainly with that first movie, that's kind of all there is. I mean, it was made very much like a student film. We were not, I graduated from college, but for all intents and purposes, it was a student film. We had, I think our crew on the largest day, we might have had 6 people on the crew, but there were some days where it was maybe 4 of us. And such a pleasure to work that way, and impossible to make anything but an organic product that way.
Thinking about your work, sort of folding in on itself is having this, like, you're in the film. It is, in my viewing experience, it's very true to a lived experience. It comes from reality. Was there a point where you were thinking about documentary film, or when you're working on writing narrative fiction that is so close to documentary? I'm just wondering if there was an impulse on your part to be real, but you said, I want to work on screenplays, I want to work in fiction, I want to provide this different experience.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think documentary is, well, and we were talking before you rolled here that was a lot of my undergraduate training. The program I came out of at Harvard had a very kind of documentary backbone to it, and it was a great. I found it to be, and I kind of drank the Kool-Aid. It's the way I learned, and now I think everybody should learn that way. But I feel like it's a terrific training for any kind of filmmaking, because even if you're doing something that's very controlled, even if you're doing animation or something, I think that the essential thing that documentary teaches you is that the thing you're going to get, no matter how well you planned, is not exactly the thing you wanted to get. And in documentary, that can be quite extreme, right? You have an idea of the story, and then you go somewhere real, and reality does not give you what you thought you wanted. And then you have to, the hardest part, and I find this when I've taught, I see this in students, and I see this with myself every time I make a movie. It never gets any easier. You have to learn to see what is in front of you. You have to see past your fantasy, past your vision, no matter how great your vision was. You have to see what's actually in front of your face and what's on the screen and what's in your footage, and work from there. Documentary was the best training ground for that, but those lessons apply to any and all kinds of filmmaking. And I think, the thing you mentioned, I feel like so much of what I do, for better or worse, I have these kind of warring impulses, or I'm split down the middle. Half of me wants to be a documentary filmmaker, and half of me wants to be a novelist, and I'm neither. But I do this thing that kind of allows those impulses to hopefully clash in a productive way.
That was it. So the second part of that was about your writing, in that there seems to be, whether it's scripted or not, there seems to be a lot of agency on the part of the actors, and it feels very natural and very real. And additionally, Mateusz Grinsky, who has worked on all your films, is that correct?
Yep.
So that's another part of it, that there feels to me like you are actually creating this environment where there is a lot of room for the natural to emerge, and for the actors to kind of present what is they're actually going through, or how they actually see the scene.
Oh yeah, and I think, that's that. I feel like the actors, and this becomes true. I started out, the first 4 films I did were with non-professional actors, and one thing that I really enjoyed about working with non-professionals, and that to some extent, I tried to retain as much of this as I can, and with professionals. But I think professional actors, and I've worked with some great ones who I adore, but their training tends to be geared towards storytelling. It's usually the professional actor's job to try to help put across the story and to help orient the audience. Whereas with non-professionals, I found it to be in some ways a great advantage for this very particular, very peculiar kind of storytelling that I wanted to be doing, where I wanted the characters to I was making movies about people who were confused and who were lost. And so there was a great opportunity to do that with people whose only fealty was to the character, where you could say to them, let's talk about who this person is and where they are at this moment and what's happening and what they're thinking and what they might be going through, and nothing else. Let's not think about where this fits in the story. It doesn't matter. Just try to get through this scene. And, oftentimes you would see the kind of uncertainties of the non-professional actor trying to figure their way through the scene. A lot of times that was part of the scene. And so, certainly those movies couldn't have been made any other way. And I felt very, very, very lucky to find a method that got that across. I also had phenomenal actors. I will say, as much as you can make distinctions between non-professionals, professionals, and people with a lot of experience who do this for a living, people who've never done it before. In every case, I was working with very, very talented actors, people who had a natural ability regardless of craft or experience.
So in those experiences where you're talking through those scenes, as opposed to, professional actors, if that's a distinction you're comfortable making, when you're talking through those scenes in particular in those early films, did you ever find the experiences that you had written, or your expectations for that character, that when you're talking through those things with people who are real people, who are thinking about them in the ways a real person would, as opposed to an actor portraying your script, did you ever find that the storylines would change, or that your approach to the material would change?
It's the approach from scene to scene, from moment to moment, but that happens with professionals too. That's what filmmaking is, right? Is that like you kind of you try to come up with something that's better than the idea. You work from the idea and hopefully bring something to life in a more interesting way. So that's, any day you're on set, you're changing things and tweaking things, and exploring too. You also don't really know what you're getting. There have been plenty of days on set where I got to the end of the day and I was like, I don't know. I have no idea what we did today. Maybe a month or 2 months or 3 months from now in the editing room, we'll find out.
I want to jump ahead a little bit to computer chess, which I think is probably my favorite personally. Mm-hmm. And again, like that question that came to me about the documentary thing, where I was like, this guy has this impulse, like this really strange impulse that really, really strikes me, where there's like completely switched styles in moving into I don't know the actual type of digital video recorder it was, and then there's all this age appropriate, from what I understand, equipment. All the computers are actually, is this true, like all vintage, and then there's some semblance of reality around the idea of this conference that the film sort of centers around. Can you talk at all about what feels like a pretty significant departure from your other work into a film that I completely love? And as you back away, it makes sense for me in some ways in your arc. But can you talk about the origin of that film, and in particular, the things that really interested me were how really obsessive you were about the technology in it?
Yeah, well, we just got so lucky. I mean, that was a total Hail Mary, leap off a cliff. I'm not sure what the right metaphor is, but that had been a back of the mind fantasy for years, and it started with those cameras. So these were analog video cameras, kind of the earliest video, going back to the late '60s. The Sony. What's it called? The Portapack. And I'd seen some of this stuff, and you see it sometimes in really old kind of maybe educational things, or it didn't have that long, or in video art of that era, if you get into that stuff.
Did you ever watch Dark Shadows, the TV show?
No.
It's a really weird, but it's a TV show that was shot like a soap opera with vampires, and
right.
It's all on video like that, and it's so jarring to watch. Anyways.
It's a unique and kind of magical look, and I think anybody, if you've ever seen it, the thing that I think sticks with people is like the light, this light over my head here. If we were shooting on those old cameras, when I did this, you would have the kind of, that image would stay burned in. The brighter something was, it would stay burned into these vacuum tubes, and you would get trails of light everywhere. And there's something very trippy and kind of magical about it, and it doesn't really look like anything else. It certainly doesn't look like film, but it doesn't really look like any of the video that came afterwards. When I was a kid in the 80s, and we first got the kind of home cameras, the technology had already moved on. You were already into the age of the chip camera, and so that particular technology was so specific to such a particular moment in time, and had so much weird trippiness built into it, and all these kind of ghost images, which also seem like almost just a great metaphor for filmmaking in general, right? It's like it's all about capturing ghosts. So I'd seen some old footage of that stuff, and I think this was also in a time I had made 3 movies on 16 millimeter, which was already kind of old school and outdated. And I was editing on 16 millimeter, which is completely outdated. And so the question I would get all the time, every time I went to a film festival or what have you, I'd always get asked, well, do you think you'll ever shoot on video? When are you going to shoot on video? And so there was this contrarian part of me that thought, oh my God, you fuckers want video, I'll show you video. So I started to fantasize about what would be the story to tell on this particular kind of video, which was like nothing else, but also was so much of a particular weird era. And somehow I can't reconstruct it, but somehow I think I'd read some allusion somewhere to the existence of these very early computer chess tournaments, and that these things just started to go together in my mind. And that was it. For years, that was all I had. It was like, that would be a cool movie. I'd like to see that movie. And I mentioned it to a filmmaker friend once. And we were talking about, impossible projects. And basically he dared me. He said, well, write a treatment and have it on my desk in 2 weeks. And I think my wife was pregnant with our first child at the time. It's a very hazy, I don't remember that much. But, I did that. I wrote this 8-page treatment, and that was that. I put it aside, and then there was a period, and I was trying to get a kind of bigger movie together. something that would cost a few $1 million and have movie stars and that sort of thing. And as you know, you hear a million stories like this from independent filmmakers. That was something that we kind of started to push uphill, and we got a famous guy who was going to do it, and then it all fell apart because these things always fall apart. And by this time, my son had been born, I think. And so I had this terror that I could see the life ahead of me where I was just a dad who never made a film again. And so I thought, I've got to make something. I'm going to pull this 8-page treatment out of the drawer, and we're going to do it. And we leaped into it we had nothing. There was no reason to think that any of this made sense. And it's kind of like Bugs Bunny running off the cliff. And, it's like we didn't have time to realize that gravity existed. So we just did it.
Wow. That is, so is there some truth in the idea that the technology actually was the thing that preceded that film? You said, I want to do something on this.
Yeah, before I knew I wanted to do something about a computer chess tournament, I was thinking about what could I do with these cameras.
Wow. So just to give some context for people at home, I mean, I think there's, who are unfamiliar with your work, there is a real, computer chess does represent sort of a pivot in my view, and I'd be interested in how you feel about it. But then was Results after that? Am I had my chronology correct? And you did not edit Results, right?
Right.
So there was a change there where you your first few films had this sort of really distinct feel, and a lot of like really close shots, really sort of emotion, or for me they're really anxiety oriented. They're really actually stressful films despite being really soft and kind of quiet. And then there's sort of this change with Computer Chess, Results, and Support the Girls. Do you feel comfortable dividing your films at that point in a way?
It's hard not to. I appreciate that there are some kind of significant differences, and yet, again, I guess this contrarian impulse in me. I mean, I will say I learned something going from Computer Chess, which was just about the most, if I were trying to dream up a list of ways to drive an audience away, that most of that list would have been in that movie. I made just about the most obscure thing I could think of. And then Results was, 180 degrees from that. I was making something that was more or less in a recognizable genre with some very attractive movie stars, and it's a very, pretty attractively made movie. And I felt like ultimately, just seeing the response that came into them, I felt like they were received as pretty much equally bizarre. So, which was good in a way. I mean, it was both a kind of scary, but also a comfort. It was a nice lesson that my voice was my voice, no matter what I tried to do with it. It was financially, it's a frightening lesson because you go, oh shit, even when I try to speak commercial, it's just avant-garde and not that commercial. But such great fun to do that movie, both of them.
Yeah, I do. I could imagine a world in which I did not know you and I saw Results, and I'd be like, that's kind of strange. Like it has all the the shape and form of a sort of a normaler film, but knowing it in your arc, it feels distinctly yours, and I find it actually a lot more enjoyable than if I went into it blind. So I think for people who are watching them, I do think seeing some of your early works, Beeswax, and then going to that, you feel some of that tension a lot more deeply that's coming out in those characters. I guess we can jump ahead now to Support the Girls, which feels like maybe you're splitting the difference in terms of tension. I think the Regina Hall character does something that is maybe in Bees. Someone who there's like this boiling up in each of the films, and it feels softer, and then it gets more and more intense, and then I can tell you personally from my work experience, like watching each of those films, like would bring out this anxiety in me. Like getting a phone call about like the receipt tape not working in the middle of dinner is like feels inconsequential, but like if you've lived through that, like the pain of that feeling. And then Regina's performance in Support the Girls is like, it's kind of relentless. She's like really shouldering a lot of very visible, very tangible stress. And I'm wondering if you can speak to sort of that stress materializing much more visibly in that film, whereas in the previous, I guess more of your earlier films prior to Computer Chess, it feels like the stress is much more latent, it's much more internalized, maybe a little more passive. Wondering if you could talk about that sort of emergence of tension.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of all internal for me. I think I'm always engaging with I think I'm always trying to manage things on that micro level, and that's where most of my enthusiasm and interest is. But Support the Girls is also, it's certainly a movie that's crammed full of plot. It's got, or at least, you know what, I don't even know what plot is. Let's say incident. There's a whole lot that's happening that she's having to deal with, and it is a kind of choreography. That was something that was, to me, the most nerve-wracking thing going into that movie, is it's almost a movie without, it hardly has any scenes by what, you know, I would think of as a kind of conventional scene standard, which of getting 2 or 3 or however many people in a room and having them kind of, you know, bounce something around emotionally, whatever. There's hardly any of that. There's a whole lot of like, Regina walks into a room, somebody tells her their problem, and then somebody taps her on the shoulder and says, no, there's a problem over here. So like, she hardly ever gets to pause for an actual interaction with anybody. She's just always getting pulled in different directions. And so it was a challenging movie to design and shoot in that way, because it did feel so much more like choreography than anything else. Of like, you just got to get the timing right on everything all the time, because there's never a moment to breathe. In some ways, I think that came from, that was something that had actually started as a television pitch some years earlier. You know, is that this, when we were kind of getting into the TV gold rush, and you know, I've got agents out in Hollywood, and they were saying, nobody does movies anymore. Let's come up with a TV idea. So this had been a TV idea. I'd gone and pitched it around. Nobody had gone for it, and that now also seems like a kind of blessing in disguise. You know, it stuck with me. And some years later, I hadn't gotten it out of my head, so I thought maybe there's a movie here. And once I did that, I think I know movie is a much more natural language to me. I've still never really learned to speak TV, and in part it's to do with structure. It's to do with the fact that you're not allowed to end a TV story, you know, unless you've got like a 12-part whatever. But I don't really know how to do stories without endings, even though my endings, you know, certainly tend to be not particular. They're not conclusive necessarily, but they are endings, and they are right where I need them to be. And so once I knew that I could take this story to a place and let it go at that place, then I knew how to write the movie. But I also, because I had done all this work, kind of, you know, filling out like, how am I going to pitch a season, or, you know, something that could turn into 5 seasons of TV. I had a ton of storylines, and I crammed a whole lot of them into that movie.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things that felt really similar to me was, you know, in Funny Ha Ha, Marnie is on screen almost every single shot. She's never not, and if she's not, she's like entering. Right. And there was a, you know, same thing, like with people who aren't familiar with your work and who would maybe find Funny Ha Ha a little challenging, whereas Support the Girls is much more, you know, inviting for, you know, I think people who are unfamiliar with what you're doing with your work. There's a real through line for me there with the way you know, Support the Girls and Funny Ha Ha follows this person, and they're dealing with this thing, where there's an interiority to Funny Ha Ha. There's much more sort of external pressure in Support the Girls.
Yeah, and that was something I was kind of actually, I think, consciously wanting to do again, because I had done it was just I think a challenge I laid out for myself, having, because Funny How It was a movie where you follow one person around and that's the movie, and then I Mutual Appreciation, Beeswax, Results are all these trios. And Computer Chess is just a big sprawling ensemble. So definitely, I think I consciously sat down and thought, I wonder if I can do another. I wonder if I'd like to try to get back to that, or see if I still have one of those in me where you just follow one person around. And it certainly makes for writing challenges, especially with just dumb things like exposition. You're like, nothing can happen, nothing can be said that she's not in the room for. So you kind of work those out.
That is one of the things I think some people do struggle with, is films that don't have conclusive endings, which doesn't bother me. I don't think life always has conclusive endings, or exposition. So that was actually going to be one of the things I was going to talk about, was in Support the Girls and in Results, we do get a little bit more of a sense of kind of what's happening, and who they are. Is that, sort of a conscious decision on your part, or do you hear, or are you immune to criticism where people say, oh, this endings leave you, wanting more, or I feel like I'm just stuck, with this story all of a sudden? Do you feel like there was sort of a conscious change on your part for those films to work on some of that stuff?
No, I think those movies have, I think they're every ending is different. But I still feel like I've never given anybody a conventional conclusion. I don't, you still don't know if these people are going to be okay. And that's, I think that's always the question. And that's always something that I have to leave to the audience, and with every film I've ever made, I think that'll be a question that comes up, like, well, what happens to them afterward? And I always feel like, your guess is as good as mine. We kind of, my work was to get them to there, and then after that, it belongs to you as much as me.
And you touched on this earlier, but that was another thing I was going to ask. The second you said the idea that Support the Girls was originally pitched as a TV show or a series or something, my brain immediately did the calculations. I was like, oh, I can absolutely see that. And it's a completely different thing. It's a completely different feeling. So that was something that was sort of on the table for you. Is that type of writing of interest? And is that something you feel like you, with that previous statement, the idea that you're trying to maybe bring a character from, A to C or A to F as opposed to A to Z, is that something that you see working particularly well in film, or do you feel like you could do that type of writing, or are you interested in doing that type of writing in another format?
I mean, TV is very interesting. And I like, there's obviously a lot of gripping and exciting TV out there. I think I would have to do it to learn it. I mean, and it comes up all the time. And if I'm able to keep going at all, it's hard to imagine I won't dip into that at some point, one way or another. But it's not intuitive to me the same way, because there is this, because I guess I feel like anything I know about making art is to do with resonance. It's to do with, and especially as a director, directing is such a strange job, because you don't do anything in particular. If you go to a movie set, you see a lot of super talented people with very specific jobs, executing very specific tasks, except the director, who kind of doesn't do anything. In my case, like, hangs out by the craft service table and I eat a lot of snacks. But somehow, it's this kind of sounding board for everybody, or like people. And the more professional it gets, the more people treat you like respectfully, which is kind of weird. But all you're doing is setting a tone, and you might have specific instructions here or there, and you might not. But it's so much to do with taking these pieces, like first getting the right pieces in the room. And I think every director will say that's the most important part of the job, is just assembling the right team to begin with and having the right things, be like that. A lot of your work, or hopefully most of your work, is done before you say action on anything. And then just moving those pieces around, whatever. And this is at every level, both on the page and your script, but also the actors and every element you're putting together, and trying to get them to resonate in the way that's most exciting. So for me, that's a lot easier to make sense of in a bounded space, which is a movie, and I don't know anything about poetry. I've never written a poem, or at least not a readable one, in my life. But that's the sense I have of that too. It's like this kind of small, it's bounded yet infinite. And within that, you just got to get the pieces to work together just right. What's kind of exciting about TV is that it moves too fast for that. And that's both the thing that scares me about it, and also the thing that I think fuels the best TV, right? Is like they just got to get something on the air every week. So there's really no time to be precious about it. But in that lack of preciousness, of course, really good shows, will make magic come up through the cracks. And I think I've always preferred the kind of inconsistent TV shows to like the super quality controlled one. I didn't, and with all due respect, obviously, to an extraordinary accomplishment, but I didn't make it through Breaking Bad, I think in part because I was like, it's too quality controlled. Like every episode is very good, and they're all very good in exactly the same way. And I can't take it. I'd much rather a show that kind of has a great episode and a shitty episode, and that to me is more exciting.
Yeah, I have a number of documentary filmmaker friends who are struggling with this thing where they pitch something and then they say, this sounds great, can you make it 6 episodes, can you make it 8 episodes, and then they bring in a team of writers. And I do feel like that form, I don't want to call it a formula, it's really mean in a lot of ways, but that sense that you get that everything is workshopped, things are missing a distinct voice, they this sort of regional dialect sort of oriented work, to me, is really, really precious and important. And I really appreciate that you're not letting go of that. It's really, really great. In mutual appreciation, and in Funny Haha, you're on screen, and all the really wonderful things you were just saying about directing and getting all your work done. Ideally, you get a lot of the work done beforehand. I'm wondering if you can talk about two, I think, really cherished film. Those 2 films are really cherished, and you being a part of writing, directing, editing, acting, what that experience was like, and how you've let go of a number of those things in favor of, it seems like, focusing on writing and directing. If you can just talk about that sort of that balance set, or how those things have balanced out over the years, over the 20 years now.
Yeah. A lot of it's resources. I think when I first decided to act in the first movie, that had a lot to do with just thinking, well, I know I'll work for free, and I know I will, show up on time. I'll show up early. And that was important. I never set out to be an actor per se, and when I have acted, I like it, and I'd like to try it again. I'd like to get up the gumption and give it another shot. It's been a while, and I'll do things, but I've only ever done things when friends have asked me to, essentially, and it's certainly something I've never pursued, and I know I wouldn't want to pursue it. I did one a few years ago, just by a kind of odd coincidence. A bigger movie was shooting in town, and I knew the casting director, and she said, will you come in and read for this role? And I read for her, and it went fine, and then she said to the director, would like to see for a callback, and then I went in, and suddenly I was gripped by terror, to sit and read for this director. It was like, I don't know what it was. It was just, I think, the natural nerves that anybody would have, but suddenly they came out, and I did a terrible job.
Have you ever have you ever had to read for a role before? I mean, you certainly didn't read for your own films.
Yeah, I guess not. I mean, I think I'd done, sometimes when you're doing something with friends, you'll do little exercises or things, or so I'd done that kind of like preliminary work, or I'll show up, or somebody says, "Hey, will you read this?" I'd done that, but I'd never auditioned in that sense, and I understand now why actors hate auditioning. It's fucking horrible. So no part of me ever wanted to do that, or ever thought I had kind of the skill set to do it. I'm when I look at what actors have to do, it's almost like this kind of, I feel like they're monks in a way, in that it's a job that's all about submitting to someone else's will. It's this weird you understand why actors are crazy, because it's like this strange combination of ego, and wanting to project something of yourself, but then also always submitting. So anyway, after, I think when I acted in Mutual Appreciation, in part that was kind of an experiment in, I'd done it in the first movie. I thought it had gone all right. I thought, let's see, let me explore my range as an actor, and I did, and I learned my range was from here to here, and that was that I felt like I had accomplished as much as I was burning to accomplish as an actor. And editing, I miss editing. I love editing. I'm a really slow editor, and so those Mutual Appreciation, Beeswax, Computer Chess were 3 movies that all took me about 1.5 years from shooting them to getting them up on the screen, which was kind of great when I could do it. Obviously, I have 2 children now, and also the budgets have grown, and and turns out that when people put money in things, they want to have at least some idea of how the money might ever come back, and so we're moving a little faster, and I've been very fortunate to work with Robin Schwartz on Results and Karen Skloss on Support the Girls, 2 editors who I really enjoy working with and are really good and can do. I'm still sitting in the room with them, so there's still a lot of my voice and in the editing, but that plus their voices, plus their brilliant talent, and plus their tirelessness. So hopefully it's a benefit all around.
Is there anything, I know there was a bunch of other things you've worked on that we didn't talk about, but do you have anything that you're planning on directing or writing or working on that's upcoming, or anything else you want to share with our audiences or direct people towards?
Oh man, everybody's stuck at home watching movies right now, so there's a million movies for them to watch. I have nothing in particular to lead them toward at the moment. And as for me, I don't know. I've written a movie that I'd very much like to make. We were hoping to shoot it this year. I don't know if anybody's going to be allowed to shoot a movie this year, so we'll see.
Andrew, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today and to inaugurate our first ever digital retrospective. Certainly deserving. You've made an incredible body of work that I really hope everyone checks out all of it, because it really speaks clearly and coherently. It really, I think, powerful aesthetic that I wish was more present in a lot of filmmaking.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for continuing to keep cinema alive over there.
Yeah, hopefully we can have you in person when our theaters reopen and we're all joined in the light of our giant glowing screen.
Can't wait. I can't, I don't think I've gone this long without sitting in a movie theater since very early childhood. So we'll all get through this.
We will. All right, Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.